ॐ पृथिवी शान्तिरन्तरिक्षकं शान्तिर्द्यौः शान्तिर्दिशः शान्तिरवान्तर दिशा शान्तिरग्निः शान्तिर्वायुः शान्तिरादित्यः शान्तिश्चन्द्रमा शान्तिर्नक्षत्राणि शान्तिरापः शान्तिरोषधयः शान्तिर्वनस्पतयः शान्तिर्गौ शान्तिरजा शान्तिरश्वः शान्तिः पुरुषः शान्तिर्ब्रह्म शान्तिर्ब्राह्मणः शान्तिः शान्तिरेव शान्तिः शान्तिर्मे अस्तु शान्तिः. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees, and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. सर्वेत्र सुखिनः सन्तु सर्वे सन्तु निरामयाः सर्वे भद्राणि पश्यन्तु मा कश्चित् दुःखभाग् भवेत् सर्वस्तरतु दुर्गाणि सर्वो भद्राणि पश्यतु सर्वसद्बुद्धिमाप्नोतु सर्वत्र नन्दतु. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the divine presence can be felt most clearly in our own hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Om Asato ma Satgamaya Tamaso ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravirmayeti Rudrayatte Takshinam Mukham Tenamam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. Welcome everyone to the first class on Viveka Chudamani. It's a book that is well known to those who have already familiar with the study of Vedanta. It's been one of the favorite books of Vedanta students for centuries, really. The name Viveka Chudamani, there are really three words there: Viveka, Chuda, and Mani. Mani is a jewel. Viveka means a discernment, and a simple way to understand that would be simply the title of the book, Looking Deeply. When we look deeply, we see things that we may not see when we look at things superficially, and that's kind of obvious. Although it is so obvious, we go through our lives not really looking deeply at things around us. Yes, there are certain things in which we are interested, we look at them deeply. But most other things pass by with a very superficial look. And that's the problem. So Viveka means that ability to look deeply and see things very clearly. And Chuda means the crest, right at the top. So the title of the book suggests that in the practice of Vedanta, the ability to look deeply is the most important practice. It's the first practice. All other Vedanta practices spring from looking deeply. If we do not look deeply, then we may do 100 other things, but it won't be effective. And therefore, this is called the crest jewel. If Vedanta were a jewel, then its place would be on top of the royal crown, like the Queen of England has this Kohinoor. So Vedanta would be the Kohinoor Mani, Kohinoor jewel on the crown. The word Viveka Chudamani may also refer to Vedanta itself, being that system of philosophy and practice which has the practice of discernment or Viveka as its most important practice, as a jewel on top. So that's the significance of the title. Now, by Vedanta is meant, as texts, it refers to the Upanishads, which are the philosophical portions of the Vedas. And it makes sense to go to the originals the original source to study Vedanta. But many of us find it difficult to go to the original source. Part of the problem is clearly the language itself. Although Vivek Chudamani is also written in Sanskrit, and the Upanishads are also in Sanskrit, there is a little bit of a difference. The Upanishads are so ancient, at least 3,000 to 4,000 years old by some reckoning, that the grammar of the Sanskrit in the Vedas is quite different from the grammar of the Sanskrit of later texts. So post-Vedic Sanskrit texts are sometimes said to be in classical Sanskrit. In other words, the kind of Sanskrit you and I might study if we go to school today and try to study the language. So Vedic grammar is a separate subject by itself. This is not to say that the two are different languages. It's still Sanskrit, but it's not as easy to understand Vedic Sanskrit as it is to understand the later texts. Now, Vivek Chudamani is a later text by Vedic standards, but it's still 1200 years ago. The other difficulty in understanding and appreciating the Upanishads is that Upanishads are not a book written by anyone. The contents of the Upanishads are more like the Vedic rishis sitting in this near the Himalayas or in the forests, sharing their revelations with one another. Nothing was being written down. This was way before things were being written down. So what you have there, kind of great revelations spread all through the Vedic literature, but not a connected narrative as some of us might see. Which is why the Upanishads cannot be studied without a commentary. And Shankaracharya, the author of Vivek Chudamani, has written commentaries on 10 of the major Upanishads. So the commentators try to connect the dots, so to speak. But in order to understand and appreciate everything that is in the Upanishads, we not only need to know the intricacies of grammar, but also some basics of other orthodox philosophical schools, such as Sankhya, Nyaya, Vaisheshika, because those are the schools, the dialectic that is created between Vedic thinking, those are the schools that are referred to again and again. So if we are not familiar with those, then again, understanding the commentaries becomes difficult. Which is why these books, like the Vivek Chudamani, they are called Prakarana Granthas. By Prakarana Grantha is meant, these are books that are relatively smaller in size, but also they deal with a specific theme and they have a running narrative. So it's much easier to follow these Prakarana Granthas. And they contain the same framework as the Upanishads. So that is the advantage of studying a book like Vivek Chudamani. Shankaracharya, who wrote this book, his writing is amazing. He lived for 32 years, just 32 years, and within that time, his output is mind-boggling. Sometimes when today we say, oh, I have no time to do things, sometimes I wonder, like, I don't think Shankaracharya ever said that, although he had much less time than most of us. Besides writing these commentaries on the Upanishads, Shankaracharya wrote many devotional hymns. He wrote these smaller texts like the Viveka Chudamani. I just can't even begin to describe how much his contribution to Vedanta philosophy is. Now, Vedanta did not start with Shankara. It's much older than Shankara. Shankara is only 1200 years ago, but Vedanta is much older. There are other teachers who came after Shankaracharya, great teachers like Ramanuja, like Madhva, and they all did not necessarily agree with Shankara's interpretation fully. They had their own interpretations, which is how different schools of philosophy grew up within the Vedantic tradition. The greatness of Shankaracharya is that whoever came after him, they either had to agree with him or to disagree with him. But they could not ignore him. They could not pretend as if he didn't exist. So he became a kind of a defining personality in the study and practice of Vedanta. So this study that we are beginning today and will continue on every Wednesday, a question that we need to be very clear in our minds is, why are we studying it? What is the purpose of this study? And there could be many answers to that. But one good answer would be that we want to be enlightened. That this book we are studying not just out of curiosity or in order to be scholars, although we will be if we study and understand it well, or to kind of boast about it with your friends and say, oh, I have finished Viveka Chudamani. That's not the purpose. The purpose is, I want to be enlightened. Now, what does enlightenment mean? And this will be discussed, of course, in the book. But I just want to briefly say that the study of Vedanta is always helpful, but probably even more helpful in the times in which we live. As we sit here, all of us masked and vaccinated, and after having seen in the last 18 months the enormous destruction of life, of jobs, of just everything in society has become affected by this pandemic. There was probably no better time to ask the question, what does all this mean? What is human life worth? When we read now and sometimes we become so insensitive to it now, when we read, oh, now there is a surge, hospitalizations have increased, and so many 2,000 people die every day. And after some time, reading this kind of news day after day after day, we just become immune to it. Then it just becomes a number. But it's not about only what's happening out in the world, but it's also looking within and asking ourselves, what is my identity? Just this small little virus can come in and completely destroy my health, perhaps take away my life, destroy my career. There's no way any of us can be sure whether it will affect us or how it will affect us. And in these times of uncertainty, is there anything in life that we can be certain about? So what this book does, it is composed of 580 verses. So it is smaller than the Gita, but not much smaller. Gita has 700 verses. This has 580. The original text is not divided into chapters and sections. At least the Gita, we have 18 chapters. So there is some kind of a scheme, we might say, in the Gita. But this book doesn't have it. So in order to make it a little bit more manageable, in this translation that we will be studying, this is the book that we will use as a textbook for our class. I've divided it into 4 sections. And we will go chronologically, verse by verse. The heart of this book is a deep looking at this simple instruction in Vedanta called Tat Tvam Asi. You are that. So what this book does is it looks deeply at you. Who is this you? It looks deeply at that. What is that? And then it looks at this whole teaching, you are that, Tattvamasi. What does it really mean? And then it shows us that if that understanding is to truly transform us, then it's not enough to just read about it. It's not enough to simply think about it. We must do something about it so that that teaching becomes my own. And one simple way of understanding that is when the teacher says, you are that. Now that is that infinite being, your pure, perfect, infinite being. So when the teacher says, you are that, and if the student is ready, if the student is fit, immediately the student's heart fills with this experience, Aham Brahmasmi, I am that infinite one. So we don't need any practice. That you just have to go, the teacher tells you, you are that, you get up and say, I am the infinite one. Not just say it, experience it, and then you are free. The question is, when the teacher says you are that, and we just sit and say, okay, what next? That means something more needs to be done. Simply hearing that has not changed us much. And so the book then that we are going to study will give us these practices about what we need to do in order to make that teaching, you are that, alive, to truly transcend our human limitations so that we can discover this immense reality which is in our hearts, but which we do not know yet. So take a look at the first verse. So I will read it, and then I will read the translation, and then we can see it in a little bit more detail. Sarva Vedanta Siddhanta Gocharam Tamagocharam Govindam Paramanandam Sadgurum Pranatosmyaham. I bow down to Govinda, who is supremely blissful, who is a true teacher, whose nature is beyond the reach of the mind and the senses, but can be known from the conclusive truth reached in Vedanta. So the first verse is called, in Sanskrit, it's called Mangala Charanam. In all these traditional texts, the beginning is always with a prayer. It's a prayer that this initiative that's been undertaken by the author, that may it be fulfilled, may it be complete without any obstacles. So you seek the grace of God, the grace of the Guru, the grace of all great ones. So that is called Mangala Charana. So I bow down to Govinda. Just drink a little water. I bow down to Govinda. Shankaracharya's guru's name was Govindapada. So he's bowing down to his teacher. Paramanandam. Parama means supreme, Ananda is joy. So the teacher who is supremely blissful. Satgurum, who is a true teacher, whose nature is beyond the reach of the mind and the senses. That is Agocharam, whose nature but can be known from the conclusive truth reached in Vedanta, which is what Sarva Vedanta Siddhanta Gocharam. Gocharam means that which can be grasped, that which can be understood. One thing becomes clear from this is that, first of all, although he is bowing down to his guru, Govindapada, the word Govinda in Sanskrit also means the protector of the Vedas or the revealer of the Vedas. So it can refer to God or it can refer to his guru, Govindapada, as well. But more importantly, it's not really referring to any person, although Govinda is the name of his guru. The reason I say that is, look at these adjectives that are used here. Whose nature is beyond the reach of the mind, who can be known only from the truth reached in Vedanta. That's exactly the kind of adjectives we will use to speak of that highest truth, highest being. So this raises a question, who is the Guru? And the answer is, the Guru is not a person. Guru is the power of the divine. Now that power of the divine is passed from one generation to the next and may come to us through the instrumentality of the teacher that we have. So the teacher, our teacher, is only a vehicle through whom that power, which is passed from times immemorial, that power has come to us. And so Guru is really a Shakti, a divine power. Guru is not a person. Just like the avatar, the divine incarnation. The divine incarnation is also not a person. Divine incarnation, the avatar, is the power of the divine. It's the Shakti. It's Ishvara Shakti. Swami Vivekananda said that we speak about the crucifixion of Jesus. And Swami Vivekananda said, no, they could not crucify Jesus. What was crucified was the body. The incarnation is not the body. The incarnation may seem to operate, to function through the body, but the incarnation is not the body. Ramakrishna had throat cancer towards the end of his life. Now, there were people who were shocked at that time. Some people felt, how could an avatar have cancer? How an avatar should have a fit body? How can an avatar fall ill? What they didn't realize was that it's the body that falls ill. It's the body that dies. It's the body that is crucified. But the one who is in that body is the one who is beyond the reach of the mind and the senses, who can be known only from the truth reached in Vedanta. And that's true, ultimately, in our lives as well. Who am I? Am I this body who's sitting here and talking, and you sitting there and listening? Or this is just an instrument that we are more than the body and more than the mind. So that is the message that comes to us from this first verse. Sri Ramakrishna said again and again that Satchidananda alone is the Guru. This Guru Parampara, as it is called, the spiritual lineage. So in the Upanishads, they sometimes mention the lineage. And the lineage is just like we have a family tree, our parents and their parents and their parents, and we can trace back our ancestry. Similarly, there is a spiritual ancestry. So my teacher, my teacher's teacher, my teacher's teacher, and it can go back that way to trace one's spiritual lineage. The interesting thing about this lineage is, whichever of these old books make a mention of this lineage, it ultimately ends up in the Hindu texts, it ends up usually with Vishnu or Shiva, meaning ultimately God alone is the teacher of all of us. And that is what Sri Ramakrishna mentioned again and again in his conversations, that Satchidananda alone is the Guru. So this very first verse of the book, Shankaracharya is saluting not only his teacher Govindapada, but also this infinite reality which is beyond the reach of the mind and the senses. Let's look at the second verse. Jantunam narajanma durlabhamatav punsvam tato vipratap tasmat vaidika dharma marga paratap vidvatvam asmat param atmanatma vivechanam svanubhavo brahmatmana samsthitihi muktirno shata janma koti sukritaiv punyair vina labhyate. It is rare for beings to obtain a human birth, progressively even more rare to obtain are a male body, a Brahmin birth, steadfast devotion to the Vedic religious path, scholarship, the ability to discern between the self and the non-self, the direct experience of the self, immersion in Brahman as the self, and spiritual freedom. None of these can be had without the merits acquired in millions of births. There's a lot to unpack here. A part of it quite controversial as we read this in the 21st century. Remember, that's why I mentioned in the beginning, this is a more than 12 centuries old text. The central message of this verse is, don't miss this opportunity. It's alerting the audience of the importance of what is going to be discussed and telling them this is a great opportunity. In fact, in the rules of public speaking and in the rules of writing as well, the one way to alert your potential readership or audience is tell them how this is relevant to them, how this is important to them, because then you will be able to hold their attention. And that is what Shankaracharya is doing here. So he's saying that how lucky you are, how rare this combination can occur. It's rare for beings to obtain a human birth. The Sanskrit they say, Narajanma, Durlabham. Narajanma means a human birth. It's rare. Why is it rare? Because there are so many, innumerable species. In the Vedantic understanding, no difference is made between a human being, an animal, and a plant. They are all living beings. They are not essentially different. And because there is scope for rebirth, that we can be born again and again, there is no guarantee that we'll always be born as human beings. In fact, I was reading somewhere, and it's long back, I might still get it wrong. Apparently, there are several hundred major species of ants itself. And then there are, of course, subspecies and so on. And like this, you can imagine that although several species have become extinct, even the species that are still surviving, their numbers are mind-boggling. And so when we die, we can be born in any of these species, as any of these. So what is the probability that we will be born again as a human being? Now, one thing we have to keep in mind, that we are all human beings, and this book is written by a human being, and this philosophy it's a human take on the situation. And so even when we have the theory of evolution, we generally see ourselves on top of the ladder. There was this cartoon I had seen when I was studying in school many years ago. This picture of a school playground, and children are playing, and there is a tree and on which a few monkeys are sitting. So there is this mother monkey and some baby monkeys. And these baby monkeys, they are looking at the children playing, and they tell their mother, "Mother, we want to go and play with them. Please allow us to go and play with them." And the mother says, "No, you are not going. You can't play with those people. They don't even have a tail yet. They haven't evolved yet." So again, if monkeys were to evolve their own theory of evolution, very likely they might say they came from human beings, that they are the more evolved species. We don't know what they think and how they see it. But since it's human beings writing about these matters, so it said it's rare to acquire a human birth, because we feel that rather than being born in any other species, it's a great blessing to be born as a human being. Now, among being a human, we can, even if we get a male body, that's even greater advantage. And of course, in today, when we think about equality of gender, etc., this seems terrible to say something like that. Again, I would ask you to remember that this was written in 8th century, when the situation was very different from now, but in some respects, not that different. Although even today, when we do speak about equality, but that still remains in several aspects still an ideal to be reached. Today, even today, it cannot be denied that males in any society, pretty much in most parts of the world, do have an unfair advantage over women. And yes, there are efforts being made for gender equality, and I do hope they succeed, but it's not yet equal. That's an experience that everybody has. Especially women obviously feel it more, because they are at the receiving end of this unfair treatment. And now the audience in 1300 years ago, what Shankara was writing in Sanskrit, it would be read only by males. It would be read only by people who understood Sanskrit, which would mean they were mostly Brahmins or people who were interested in Vedantic study. So it was a very narrow segment of the society which was the potential reader of what Shankara was writing. So keeping them in mind, he's telling them how lucky you are, how rare is this chance that you have a male body, a Brahmin birth, a steadfastness towards the Vedic dharma. You have this viveka to distinguish between the self and the non-self. You have an experience of the self, and so on. And he says, all of these things that you have, keep in mind that this is just a result of the great punya that you have acquired in past births. Which also means be careful of what you do now, what you think now. Because even as we can count the blessings in our life today and be happy and grateful for the good things in our life, if we remember that the things that are good, things that we are happy about in our life, is a result of the good karma of the past, what I am going to experience in the future will depend on the kind of karma I do now. And karma doesn't simply mean physical activity, it also means mental activity. So, what kind of thoughts I think and what kind of actions I do now will determine what my future situation will be. So you've already find a reference to karma, and more will be discussed in this text. So remember again that the controversial as some of these aspects might be, if you remember that the main focus of that teaching is that count your blessings. Recognize that the good things in your life have come as a result of your good karma. Continue doing that so that the future will be a welcoming, happy future as well. Verse 3. Durlabham trayame vaitat devanugraha hetukam manusyatvam mumukshutvam mahapurusha samshrayaha. The following three are rare and are acquired only through God's grace: a human birth, an intense desire to be free, and the guidance of a great soul. Rare, the word is durlabham, difficult to get. Again, it's the same theme that was in the earlier verse, that a human birth, clearly, we are very lucky, we are born as human beings, so it's already a great opportunity given to us. If in our hearts there is this desire to have and live a spiritual life, we are even more lucky. Because just look at the people around you. Look amongst your friends. How many would want to come and spend even an hour weekly to read and study Vedanta? The number is small compared to so many other things people could do at this time. So, not only are we lucky to be born or get this human birth, we are also fortunate that we have this longing to understand the reality, a longing to lead spiritual life. And a third thing, which is rare, is Mahapurusha Samshrayaha, the guidance of a great soul. So what is being pointed out here is that all of these three are rare, durlabham, and also Deva Anugraha Hetukam, have come only by God's grace. That is, be grateful. Be grateful for the good things in your life. There is no place in life for pride or egoism. The same idea continues in the next verse also. Labdva kathanchin narajanma durlabham tatrapi punstvam shrutipara darshanam yastvatma muktau na yateta mudhadhihi sahyatmaha swam vinihantya sadgrahat. If a man does not strive for the freedom of the self after acquiring a rare human birth, as well as a male body and mastery of the Vedas, he is a fool who commits suicide, since it is like killing oneself by clinging to unreal things. You can see again, once again, there is a reference to this advantage of being a man, a male. But even other interesting point in this is that a new definition of suicide. By suicide we normally understand taking one's life. And terrible as that is, from a Vedantic perspective, if one body goes, another body will come. So yes, it's terrible, but nothing much has changed. You just changed an old body, exchange it for a new one, but not a new mind. So if I have a troubled mind and I feel that the best way to get rid of this troubled mind is to kill myself, I have not solved the problem at all. Because if I am born again, I will have a new body, but same old mind. It's a little bit like if you have an old car and the engine is breaking down again and again, and someone says, you know, I can give you a new body for your car. It'll be shining and it's slick and it's wonderful. But, you know, that's not going to solve the problem. The car is still going to break down because the engine is not being changed. The engine of our life right now is not the body. The body is just the external. The engine is really the mind. That is what is keeping it going. So this is an important factor to remember, that in every birth, we get a new body, we don't get a new mind. The mind that we have now is the mind that has been with us for millions of births. In fact, it is the mind that provides the continuity from one life to the next. The memories, thoughts, impressions, fears, all of these things remain in a very subtle form inside the mind, and they get carried over to the next birth. Which is what makes us different from one another. Even those born in the same family, siblings, with same parents, going to the same school, studying under the same teachers, yet turn out to be so different. So it's not just about nurture. It's not just about the environment. Yes, the environment does influence us, but something within is different also. So our body is as old as we are, in the sense that we calculate our age from the time we were born, but birth really means just getting a body. But the mind inside that body is much older than that. Look at the next verse, and we'll stop with this next verse. Itaf kon vasti mudhatma yastu swarthe pramadyati durlabham manusham deham prapya tatrapi paurusham. Is there any greater fool than the man who, having acquired a rare human birth in a male body, neglects his own interests? Very strong language is being used here. Although in simply saying greater fool, but in Sanskrit the word is mudha. There's sometimes it has a much greater force in the Sanskrit language than simply sometimes fool. It probably doesn't have as much as a force as this mudhatma. It's pretty strong language. So in these first 5 verses, not much philosophy here, but reminding us that we are very lucky, that we are born as human beings, we have interest in spirituality, that we should not miss this opportunity. If we miss this opportunity, having acquired this privilege in our life, if we don't put it to good use, then that is the real suicide. Taking away one's life is nothing compared to that. Because if we miss the boat now, there is no knowing how many millions of more births we might have to take again to get a human birth. And it's possible we might get the human birth and have no interest in spirituality that time. And then we might have to take trillions more births, and then we are born as human beings, have interest in spirituality, but maybe don't get any opportunity to meet an enlightened being to guide us. Now, for all these 3 to come together, it's a very rare occurrence. Sometimes you might remember if there is some a constellation of planets, or they are aligned in a certain way. Sometimes they tell us, astronomers might say, oh, this better go tonight and look at that rare way these planets are aligned, because this may not happen again for another 3,500 years. So this is really our only opportunity. This is exactly like that. For all these 3 things to come together, and to whatever extent they have come together in our own life, we have to recognize that this is a rare chance which we should not miss. So that is how this book begins. And going forward, we'll see how Shankaracharya develops this subject and helps us understand the purpose and goal of life. So if you have any comments, questions, thoughts, please raise your hand, and Vikram will bring the mic and then you can speak. Akshaya?
Namaskar, Swamiji. From a learning and development perspective, it would be helpful if I had memories of all of these countless millions of births so that I could have that accumulated lessons that I've learned from all of those experiences. But from birth to birth, we forget. So what is the purpose of that forgetting in each birth, of all the past experiences?
There is no purpose of forgetting. If we want to remember it, we can. So it was not that it was designed that way, but it's just that our mind has not been trained to remember those things. In the Yoga Sutras, Patanjali speaks about even acquiring the memory of past births, of what we were, where we were. It's possible. Is it necessary? Is it advisable? And I would think not. I mean, life is complicated as it is now. Now, remembering last birth where I was and what I was, it's just too much information to process. I don't think it is going to help. So it's not about remembering the details of the past, but as you said, remembering the lessons. So if we can train our mind in such a way that the lessons that we learned in life, if we don't forget them, the chances are we will make fewer mistakes in life. Most of the mistakes we make are repeat mistakes. And history repeats itself because we don't learn from history. And we don't learn from history because we have forgotten it. Our own history. I'm not just talking about world history. So yes, it's true, we forget. We also forget the lessons. But we can stop that now. If I can resolve, say, going forward, every day before going to bed, I can ask myself, what have I learned today? And if there is something I have learned, I should say, I'm not going to forget it. If I've done something stupid today and I've recognized the stupidity of it, I can say, well, I can be stupid in other ways tomorrow, but not in this way. So we can begin now.
And verse 3 seems to assume that there is some discernment already. In verse 3 says, good fortune to have some discernment. Ability to discern between the self and the non-self. I think that might be verse 2. So is there an assumption that there's already some existing discernment in the
Could you say clearly what is it?
In verse 2 on page 14, it says, it's rare to have the ability to discern between the self and the non-self.
Yep.
So is it assuming that we already have some degree of viveka to actually pick up the text?
Sure. I mean, we already have the ability to discern between self and non-self up to a point. For instance, I know this is me and all this is not me. So some discernment is there. But we don't push that discernment further. If I look deeply, then I might discover that which I see as me, there may be some not me here as well. So yes, we do have some discernment now, but it needs to be pushed further. Yes.
Thank you, Swamiji. Mine was,
Please hold the mic closer. So yeah.
Is it better now?
Yeah.
So it's just more of a comment, like that in two verses, like I feel at the same time relief and also with some anxiety. Like relief because it's like at the end is everything is up to God, even this birth and even my interest, because we can do what we want, but we cannot want what we want. And the guidance, that's up to God. But and the anxiety is like I have to work on this gift. So it's like it's kind of like bittersweet message that is given to us, and this. But I at the end, like everybody, you know, there is this promise that we will be all liberated because we are like already. So like I just like the contrast of these two verses. And
Sure. Yeah. I agree with you. Yeah. Rajdeep. Yeah.
So Swamiji, I actually wanted to echo the same question or the comment that was made just right now. I found it very interesting that in the second verse, Shankaracharya emphasizes the punya that you accumulate over so many births, and then you get a rare opportunity in terms of satsang, in terms of being able to practice spirituality. In the third verse, he straight away says that it's really the grace of God that actually brings about everything. And in fact, there are many sadhus who say that it is really satsang is never obtained by your merit. It is really an act of grace. So this is really interesting, and I was wanting to see if you can expand on that.
Nothing to expand, just grace.
But then
It'll come. I mean, the idea is to, because a lot of time people say, I'm a self-made person, I worked hard for it. And yes, it's not that they did not work hard for it, but a spiritual seeker even in that situation says, if God had not given me the energy and wisdom to work hard, I wouldn't have been able to do it. And so the more this higher power has a place in our life, the better chance we have of going to the truth. Because the major obstacle is the ego. And so this recognizing the grace of God is a way of puncturing the ego. Yeah. Yep, that's right.
Namaskar, Swamiji. So my question is about verse 4. The kind of inner feeling I have about that is it's calling out, a person has to have the mastery of the Vedas, and if they don't, then it's kind of suicide, which you explained. When I look at my friend circle, for example, not a lot of them would be super interested in studying the Vedas, but I wouldn't not think of them as like more advanced souls in some way than me, because some of them are way better than absorbing emotions and surrendering, not maybe to God or being religious, and they don't have mastery of the Vedas in any way, but they seem to be making some sort of spiritual progress. They don't come to the lectures. So like, how do we, this seems very Vedas driven, and so how do we think of that with the other friends in our life who we think are also making progress without actually coming and studying?
By Vedas does not necessarily mean only these books called the Vedas. The word Veda, if you go to the root meaning, it means with knowledge. So any kind of a revelation, not just in the Hindu tradition, any kind of a revealed text from any tradition, so long as it helps us transcend our human limitations and look at the reality beyond, all that would be Vedas. All that would be a revealed text. Yeah. Anybody else? Yes, Ashish?
Swamiji, thinking about the other way, is there a promise maybe later in the book that if we work really hard in this life on spirituality and trying to get the goal of enlightenment, and let's say it doesn't happen, that we will be born as humans again, there'll be a higher probability that we are born as humans to continue our struggle?
That's very difficult to say, but your question is based on this assumption that being born as a human being is somehow a higher thing, which it may not be. There are a lot of people who are dog lovers who feel that dogs are infinitely superior to us than we are, which may be, we don't know. We look at everything from a human perspective. So rather than asking whether there's a greater chance that I might be born as a human being, it might be good to ask that no matter, if at all I have to be born again, may I be born in circumstances by which I can continue my quest towards truth and knowledge. And it could be anywhere. Also, being born again, don't limit it only to this planet, miserable little planet called the Earth. God's universe is much large. It's huge. So rebirth doesn't necessarily mean only here. It could be anywhere in God's creation.
Yeah, thank you, sir. That's kind of what it's stated that way. But essentially, circumstances where I can continue my struggle, wherever, whatever they are.
Absolutely. In fact, that's the promise Krishna gives in the Gita. Shuchinam Srimatam Gehe, that if I have been striving to attain the truth, if I'm a spiritual seeker, if I'm a devotee, and if I die before attaining the goal, then that journey continues in the next birth in circumstances which are favorable for me to continue the journey. One way to understand that is, nature tends to follow the path of least resistance. So if I want something really badly, I just want it, then somehow nature rearranges the circumstance such a way that I will get it. And so even if somebody has a purely materialistic goal, that I want to be a billionaire, and if I give my whole body, mind, energy, everything toward that goal, I will be a billionaire one day. May not be according to my own timetable, may not be right now, immediately. It may be after a few births, but I will be, if that's what I want. That's why Swami Akhandananda, a great disciple of Ramakrishna, once said that if you want something, you will get it. That's the law. But if you don't want anything, you will get everything. Now that's tough. I mean, it's easy to say, I don't want anything. But if you can truly touch your heart and say, I don't want anything, I don't expect anything from anyone in life, and if that's the truth, you will already get everything. But it's so difficult. Yeah. Yes. Yep.
Swamiji, when we write, we often refer and use references from the sources. When Shankaracharya ji wrote the Viveka Chudamani, did he refer back to the original Upanishads, or is this his realization from his knowledge?
It's both. Both. Everything that Shankaracharya says in this book is completely in harmony with the Upanishads. In fact, it's the Upanishadic wisdom made it little bit more digestible to us in a way that we can understand. And clearly, unless he had experienced it in his own life, he would not be able to express it so clearly. Yeah.
Thank you. I was just very struck by that last quote you gave about if you want something, you will get it. If you don't want anything, you'll get everything. And if you follow that, is it accurate to say that ultimately we should even let go of the want, the desire for enlightenment itself?
Yes, I mean, it's like this. If I want enlightenment and I don't want anything, wanting enlightenment is one way of not wanting anything else. And so what does being enlightened mean? Being enlightened means, in Vedantic terms, you don't lack anything. So you won't want anything once you become enlightened. So I think wanting enlightenment is a good want. If we must have a desire, it's better to have a desire for enlightenment rather than a desire for any other things. That's the idea. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay, so we will stop here today. And next Wednesday, again at 7:30, we will continue with this. Om Jananīṃ Sāradāṃ Devīṃ Rāmakrishnaṃ Jagadgurum Pādapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamāmi Muhurmuhu. So we will meet again on Sunday as usual for our satsang, and next Wednesday we'll continue this study. We'll conclude with a prayer now. May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto us.